So, since I was a child, our parents would take us to museums, and I'd say my adult life, libraries and museums have been my salvation. But many years ago already, I was always extremely intrigued by the dynamic between oneself and the warder and the museum guard, and the painting, say, or sculpture, and especially when you found yourself alone in the room with them, and I was, for many years, very intrigued by the psychology of the warders, and had decided to set a novel in a museum. And I'm very happy Stephen's novel this book didn't come out before mine, because it's so extraordinary, and I would have been completely inhibited and not been able to write mine probably. And also, I never had the experience of working as one, so this one takes you into the dark interior in the way that I wasn't able to experience it firsthand. But I did spend many hours in the National Gallery, many hours with my notebook, sort of mapping the place, and as Gareth says, searching for sort of sites of tension, and sitting on the benches, not in the chairs of the warders, but just trying to imagine what the thought processes that they would have. And I drew up a list of questions, and quite timidly would approach warders in different museums, and the final question was always asking them about their relationship to invisibility, and ask them whether they preferred to be noticed in a room or whether they preferred for visitors to walk past them. And without fail, every single person I spoke to said that they preferred to remain invisible and not be acknowledged, at least maybe by sight, but not even. They said they didn't want to be acknowledged. Anyway, and then when I was writing my book, I was thinking of, well, different landscapes within the museum, and then also and different topographies. So I thought about craquelure, which is the way oil paintings crack, and thinking about how every surface eventually gives way to tension. But I also, when I was working on the book, I came across in a secondhand shop in Paris a book by a former director of the Pompidou called La malaise dans les musées, and it was basically saying malaise in the museums, and it was a refutation. He was basically saying that after decades of working in museums, that they were just places of stasis and cultural entropy. And then there was a more enlightening, an essay by Adorno, I don't know if you read it, called The Proust Valerie Museum, which is where he talks about the play between museum and mausoleum, and saying how there's not much difference, and how museums are sort of family sepulchres. And then he has a line from Proust saying, everything carries within it the impulse of its own destruction, or something. So anyway, so it was just, reading your book was also so riveting, seeing that we were so drawn to similar tensions within the museum, even though, for me, I wasn't, for instance, at the National Gallery, they didn't let me peer into the cafeteria, because I just said, so I had to imagine all these spaces, and so anyway, so I'm just going to read two short passages. Oh yeah, so this is the novel Asunder, and it's set in the National Gallery, and the first draft was a male warder, and then I realized actually it'd be more interesting to write from the perspective of a female warder, and in some cases, and then my narrator Marie, her great grandfather Ted was the warder on the day that Mary Richardson attacked the Rokeby Venus, the Velasquez. And so there's sort of, in the book there's two different sort of lines of destruction. One is a more violent one, and then one is sort of slow death and entropy. So yeah, I'm just going to read two passages. It was nearing 4 that Tuesday, an autumn day that had started like any other, and the light in the museum lay on the cusp of natural and artificial illumination. The skylights and louvers still filtering in what they could of the early dusk, the light sensors poised to climb a notch as soon as they registered a gloaming. I was in room 25 with the Van Hoogstraten peep show, always a source of curiosity, at least at first. 4 adolescents came in and gathered round, taking turns to peer in through the side holes as if they were dark, forbidden slits. Yet I knew their interest wouldn't last. Despite the cupids on the exterior, the Hoogstraten contained nothing but a masterly exercise in perspective. The bare, orderly, well-swept interior of the 7th century Dutch home. The only living beings, a spaniel with tawny eyes, and 2 women, one night-capped in bed and the other seated in the far background reading a book with the silhouette of a man behind a door. Familiar with expressions of disappointment, the promise of something erotic trumped by the everyday, I watched with satisfaction as the teenagers shrugged and moved on. And then I saw the man's face heading towards me, his legs taking long strides in my direction, and though his command of English was shaky, he managed to articulate with a few words and as many gestures that he and his wife had noticed that the guard in room 23 was unwell. I left the teenagers and hurried to tell Roland, who was haunting the threshold between 26 and 27, that I was going to investigate an incident and could he in the meantime alert security. And with that I took a sharp turn into room 23 to find my colleague Leighton Crook slouched in his black leather chair. Instead of the formal vertical required of our profession, his body was slanting to the right, a 40-degree angle tipping into 45, as if nailed to the chair at the base, but struggling, after decades of obedience, to wrench itself free. His eyes had withdrawn their vigil, and his hands lay formless and inert in his lap. I approached as calmly as I could and tapped the stiff shoulder encased in the grey uniform. Crook was nearly 70 and had dozed off on the job before. After the tapping failed to produce a reaction, I held up his wrist and felt for his pulse, pressing lightly and then, upon feeling nothing, a bit harder. It seemed extremely faint, if present at all, but I didn't trust myself to declare any man dead or alive. I thought I could detect some faint life current, but wasn't sure. It could simply be the residual warmth of an expired system. And, fearing it would soon be altogether non-existent, I stepped out of the way to allow Frances from Human Resources to take charge. With a cool air of authority, years of moving with ease through the different strata of our museum, she crouched down beside Crook and reached for his other wrist, removed his watch, and pressed her forefinger and middle finger against the base of his thumb far more assertively than I had, the pale blue veins that ran beneath his papery skin forming an unlikely continuum with the blood-red polish of her nails. Curious visitors had begun to turn away from the pictures towards the spectacle in the chair, and I could almost sense the man's fading pulse radiating outwards into the room as if searching to latch on to new hosts. 2 more colleagues arrived, murmuring loudly, their agitation unconcealed. Frances stood up, straightened her skirt, and asked us to help clear the room. Just as the last visitors, the couple who'd found him, by then probably feeling invested in the man's fate, had left, 4 medics rushed in through the far door with a stretcher. Something was happening in the gallery, a flicker of an event that would soon be committed to the annals, and this time I was part of it. But from a historical perspective, it was only the quiet death of a 68-year-old, felled, most likely, by a heart attack. I had to remind myself as I watched sadly on, as the corpse was gently lifted, laid on the stretcher, and removed. And now I'm going to read a section later on when Marie, my narrator, is sitting in a room and an art restorer enters with her students. The woman stopped in front of a small fanaïque, an intriguing portrait of a man in a red turban, possibly the artist himself, a painting I'd always liked despite knowing little about it. The students fanned out like apprentice surgeons at a dissection and pinned their eyes on the subject. From my chair, I watched and listened. Paintings, too, are vulnerable to the ravages of time, the restorer began. They crack and they flake, their colors change, things fade or darken. Any work you see today will have looked rather different than when it was created. And if you look closely, not too closely, you will note that just about every painting in this gallery contains a vast network of cracks. And these cracks are what we call craquelure. She spelled out the word. A dozen hands took note. Inherent craquelure, the release of stress, occurs with age. Most of the tension in a painting is located in its 4 corners. Accidental craquelure, such as spiral cracks and spider cracks, is a result of external impact. Look at this fanaïque. Your attention is probably first drawn to the red turban, to the magisterial way in which each fold has been painted. From there you move on to the face. It is more cracked than wrinkled, you can see. The paint's age shows more than the man's. This type of grid craquelure is created when primary cracks, which follow the direction of the brush stroke, and secondary cracks run in right angles to one another. Aging cracks often follow the lines established by drying cracks. Mechanical forces will always seek out the path of least resistance. Some students leaned forwards, pressing dangerously close to the phenite. My impulse was to intervene and ask them to take a few steps back, but I was crushed by my fever to hear more. Over time, the art restorer continued, I hope you will all learn to identify fake craquelure, which forgers add to a painting in order to give it the illusion of age. They scrape the edge of the canvas on a table, bake it in the oven, and sprinkle sugar on top until the surface cracks in just the right way. There are other techniques too, but this is one of the most effective. But in the words of the great Friedlander, forged craquelure is arbitrary, monotonous, and pedantic, whereas natural craquelure throbs with rich variety. So, craquelure grants a painting its history, its authenticity, a whole topography the painter himself could have never envisioned. When they left the room 20 minutes later, I closed my eyes in order to process her words. Like a hot grill, the image of the phenite pressed into my eyelids despite the cracks being indistinguishable from where I sat in my chair. After hundreds and hundreds of hours in the gallery, how had I failed to consider something so vital? I'd always been drawn to decomposition, to the knowledge that everything in the universe tends from order to disorder, and the thought of the arrow of time also moving through paintings overwhelmed me. Painters create order from disorder, but the moment that order has been created, the slow march towards disorder begins again. I'd been handed a secret. Visitors could stand and admire what they saw on the walls, point out to one another the various colors and compositions, but my inner lens would now be focused on something more hidden, an intimacy between me and the paintings that 1,000 gazes could not disturb. I'd always sought quiet in the world, and there were few movements quieter, I realized, than paint cracking over time. Days after the restorer's visit, those 3 syllables, craquelure, continued to rumble in my head. The lure of the crack, the lure of the crack, the lure of the crackle, the lair of the kraken, the crack of dawn, the crack of doom. That's it.